large, most of us deal with stuff.
Yeah.
That is the stuff that is the residue of people or the product of people, but not the people themselves. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you could think of examples of ways that you've seen that play out that would be particularly relevant to a museum audience of people who were with the stuff.
That's interesting as an example. I mean, even looking at, say, the Hunters Point project, right? That could have easily existed as a vacant piece of land until PG&E was ready to sell it. And it would have been fine, right? Like, there's nothing in their mission that says that they need to somehow have that land have a productive use.
Mm-hmm.
But it was clear to several people within the company that this was not going to work, like that actually was totally the wrong use, that having it be activated would give it life and give it meaning. And they're the ones who've been really helping to spearhead this project.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for me, I've often, as an architect, I'm trained to do buildings. And there are many beautiful buildings in this world that don't have anyone in it, or that the people who are in it hate it. Mm-hmm. Aesthetically, it's gorgeous, but if people don't use it or don't like it, is it a good building?
Right.
And I kind of think it's not. And so for me, the ultimate aim is like, how do you actually get people to use these spaces, and how do you make these spaces have some sort of impact in their lives, a positive impact in their lives? And if you take that as the imperative, then it changes the way in which you practice and move forward. And I often tend to use, so design thinking is kind of a way of an approach, but I tend to use human-centered design more often, because I think it really speaks to always putting the person at the center of what you are doing.
Yeah.
Whereas design thinking sometimes has the danger of just still being as esoteric as whatever you're using, whatever you're replacing that process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. Themes that rose up for people. The focus on the human as opposed to the object was obviously a big one for me. I see a hand going back up there. Is that Coven? Of course. Coven.
Can you stand up so I can actually see you?
Right.
Yeah, we have these two blinding lights. They're just a cool silhouette.
Am I just like a, yeah. Can you
I can see you
see
better
me?
than when you were sitting.
I was really interested in this idea of sort of more systemic research to try and and better understand the nature of sort of where this particular solution that maybe brought you into the problem space in the first place, sort of where it sits within everything. And this is a question that we deal with in museums all the time, but the problem is it's hard for us to do systemic research because the people that we can do that with are the people that are least representative of how we fit in that overall system. Our visitor, the people who have already decided to visit tell us the least about what role we as a museum need to play in our city or in our. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, in projects that you've done, you've sort of found the kind of edges of the system that you're studying, like how because you obviously in a lot of cases went in with a very particular problem that you were studying and then determined, oh, actually we're evaluating something very different of which maybe this is a component. I wonder if you could just talk about sort of how you get to that point a little bit more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and just to amplify that a little bit, I think one of the things that I thought was very powerful was the fact that you were able to say that the problem we were sent in to solve is the wrong problem, really, and being able to speak that truth back is oftentimes where change gets to be really hard.
Mm-hmm.
If that person is your boss, say, and they have sent you to do a thing, and you realize that that's really not the thing we should be doing. Being able to address that in some productive way can be really kind of fraught.
Yeah. Well, so I think that the start of every project is kind of, I think you have to start with something, right? So even if it ends up not being the right thing, it's important to start with it as that dart in the wall that you can then react against. And so usually what I do is I take whatever that problem is, I take whatever the client will say are the issues, and then out of that construct, well, who seems to be the stakeholders around this system? So there's usually a kind of stakeholder mapping that happens very early on with an understanding of, usually it's really clear what the stakeholders are in terms of end users, like just by the basis of how the problem is usually framed. What usually requires some more conversation with the client representatives is like who some of these other stakeholders might be. And so that's at IDEO.org. Oops. I'm a very handsy talker, which sometimes gets to be a problem. At IDEO.org, we used to talk about this idea of looking in and looking out. So looking out is something that we're probably familiar with in terms of engaging, say, a neighborhood or something like that, right? But the looking in is actually looking into the organization that is sponsoring the thing and actually asking probative questions and identifying stakeholders within that, because whatever you create ultimately has to be implemented by someone, right? So it's like, who are the people who are involved in that implementation or making decisions around that implementation? And so automatically there you get some more people in which to interview. And oftentimes it can be an exploratory thing where I'll be out talking to end users or some of the early stakeholders I've identified, and I'll realize, oh crap, I should be talking to some other people. So I was doing, I'm working on a project from my alma mater, Wellesley, and it's an interesting project for someone who does social innovation work. But what was really interesting is like there were two really clear early stakeholders, and then in some of the interviews, like this third stakeholder kept on popping up. And they were not given to me initially as someone I should be talking to as part of the project. And I was like, but everybody's mentioning them at some point in the process. So clearly they're people that I need to talk to. And I got a lot of really interesting data when I did go out and talk to them. So it's continuing to have that exploratory frame of mind. And part of the looking in process is also so you can understand what are the motivations from the decision makers that then helps you understand what do they need to be able to understand success here. Because in order to figure out how to package your findings to be able to sell it to them, it also has to be baked within the things that make sense for them, right? Like I think the biggest learning of operating in the social innovation space is sometimes we kind of are like, it's for the community, right? That terrible word again. And you know, as long as it's responding to their needs, it's great. And I think when you do that without a purpose or without an understanding that there are these infrastructures that are ultimately the ones that need to take this for it to scale and get beyond this little nugget of an idea, your solution will be very limited at best. So a good majority of my clients are actually big corporations, big NGOs, behemoths. But like that's part of because I feel to scale the social innovation, they have to be partners as well. So understanding what they need to see win and to fit this within either their business line or their program line is super important.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting question, I think, for people to think about is to what extent, when you're designing your design processes for products, you actually look into the organization as much as you look out at who are the recipients, because that kind of, I think oftentimes we assume that our workflows and internal processes are just what they are and all of the work faces out, and being able to look back in and see, is this the way we should be doing what we're doing, is not necessarily a byproduct or a nice to have thing. It can be kind of essential to doing it differently.
It also assumes that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah. Well.
Which we all know is rarely ever the case.
Right.
So understanding what page those people are on helps you sort of figure out where you need to construct this thing so that there can be a larger sense of buy-in.
Yeah. So here.
Yes. Well, I'm very excited because you guys in the MCN decided to bring Liz as...
We're excited too.
Yeah. So I'm particularly excited because I've been looking into social enterprise and social innovation as major concepts for museums and possibly conducive to the work we do in museums. And I was talking to Liz a few minutes ago that the concept itself, social innovation, is not very uncommon to museums. And if you look at the Tech Museum at San Jose, they do programming around social innovation and how to help the homeless people in the community a lot of work is being done in the UK with Tony Butler around social enterprise and social innovation. So I have tons of questions for you, but I know it's not possible to ask all these questions. I just want to ask you, if possible, when you talk about social innovation, social enterprise naturally comes up. You know, they are both terms and are used in the field. You know, Harvard, they have social enterprise program. Stanford, they have the Social Innovation Center for Social Innovation. So do you see conceptually there is a difference between social enterprise and social innovation, or do you think both, you know, two terms but refer to the same thing?
At least in my understanding, I feel like social enterprise constitutes more this idea of setting up businesses or organizations that are doing the work, and social innovation is more about the process or the outcome that you're trying to get. So they're kind of related, but they're talking about different entities in a sense. So yeah, I mean, the interesting thing for me is I kind of feel a little bit like some of the language around social enterprise, social innovation, I could go on and on and on, is a little bit like the sustainability of now, right? It's like the buzzword, everybody's super interested in it. And I think for me, the most important thing is like, how do we make sure that actually what's at the heart of what these things are talking about actually gets instantiated, right? Like, because there will be a time where this is no longer the topical buzzword. And if all of this other stuff that is associated with it disappears at that time too, that would be really sad. So I'm really interested in how do we get past sort of saying, oh, we're doing social innovation or we're doing design thinking, to like, how have we fundamentally changed the way in which we're working, that it's no longer about that term, it's just about the way in which we work. And I think that that's the goal that so whatever you can learn from these movements is great, but the actual end goal is how do we instantiate this as part of our practices, that it's just a normative practice as opposed to part of whatever is this movement that we see happening right now.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things we wrestle with, particularly being by nature sort of conservative organizations. We're all about making it last forever,
Yeah.
so that tends to, I think, also infect our own processes. In many ways, we're still sort of 19th century, maybe even 18th century, depending on who you are. So oftentimes, I find that when we talk about change, again, it's something that we talk about like, okay, we're going to change, but we're going to do things exactly the way we've always done them from time immemorial, but we're going to change.
We're just using a different word to describe it.
Right, and being able to live inside that and figure out how you actually change yourselves as well as do things differently out in the world is something that a lot of the people here are very excited about. So I think the call to actually do something, how do you have that big idea as well as you actually get something done, the starting somewhere.
I mean, I think starting small, like with the Hunter's Point project, it's not like we said, oh, we're going to build that crazy diagram you saw me show towards the end. It was like, we're just going to take a shipping container, we're going to paint the ground, and we're going to build this little booth. And then that has allowed then, and our aspirations at that point were just to do the StoryCorps thing, and now it's mushroomed to a wide variety of programming, and like a larger idea for what you're going to do. And it was also really interesting.
There's a dance party.
Or a juggernaut rolling along, yeah.
I think that, the problem with change, and I was talking to Lindsay last night, I was saying this, I was like, the problem with change is that people fear change. It's really scary. And there's like people who are super comfortable, like I'm usually pretty good, like I like my routines, but I'm pretty good about like just flying off the cliff and then hoping that there's something there at the bottom. And if not, then I'll just dust myself off. I hopefully won't die from the experience. But there are a lot of people for whom that is so not comfortable whatsoever, and they will be stick in the muds because they would rather stay with whatever is not working than move over to that thing that they don't know what will be on the other side. And so the figuring out what are ways that you can start small is part of this idea of within being small, there's room for failure. Like if you do something small and you fail, it's kind of okay. Because it's like falling off the bike and skinning your knee, not getting into the dramatic car accident. And so and I think the important thing is more, you're keeping your eye on the ball, that your ultimate agenda is that, but you're looking at this as a kind of step along the way to get there, and ultimately getting there is an accumulation of all of these small steps and the learnings from those steps,
right.
and the confidence that it gives people. Like when we did the circus last year, the amount of like heartache that we had of just like getting everybody to be okay with it and not have like a complete freak out was like, my email, my phone was just taken up for days. This year, when we're like, so we're gonna do a circus, and then I had this awesome idea of doing a 100-foot giant fun slide. Barely and I batted, right? You know, and so it was like more like we're so excited to be there, and it's such an awesome event.
Right.
And so it's just sort of like, because we did it the first year,
Yeah.
and we kind of kept it small, it's just a circus, just some clowns, and one trapeze artist. People saw it, and if it failed, it would have been fine, and we would have recovered from that. But it was such a success that then people redoubled their efforts or interest in the project.
Right.
And I see that basically with all of my projects, there's an element of prototyping to try and do these things at a small scale to allow us to fail, allow us to learn. Even when I teach classes, I usually set up the final project knowing that about 70% of the students will fail. But within the exercise, I actually ask the students that your final report to me also has to say what you learned from that failure, or what you learned from the experience of prototyping, and how you would change it if you had time to do it again. So I think it's like when you're executing these projects, how can you think about it in that vein instead of trying to go for the big kahuna? What's a small thing you can do?
Miriam.
I want to talk about, because one of the things you said, the theme was, you said people feel that the gentrification train has left the station. And I wanted to address this idea of the cultural commodification train leaving the station. Last week was Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos in New Mexico, where I live. And a thing happened, we have this big parade in the historically old Hispanic part of town, Marigold Parade, people dress up. And over the last 3 years, the other side of town, the like white yuppie hipsters, have sort of taken over the parade, and now the people who started it stay away. It's in their part of town, and yet if you talk to them, they're like, oh, well, now all the white people do that. That's not our thing anymore. And it's, so what about this thing of like something being so successful that it's been commodified in a space?
Yeah, I mean,
What then?
yeah,
No, and so,
You've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. That's a hard one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, so I would say, I have one thought both about like when we see these things happening, and then I have another thought about like now that it has happened. So I think one of the things is like when we see these things happen, oftentimes the reaction can be, well, it's just the forces beyond my control. And that's kind of BS. Like, the forces are there. So not that so like say, but it's like you have things you can control. So for example, in Hunter's Point, we have our one little piece of property. There's so many other properties turning, like we cannot stop the forces of gentrification, but it does place an imperative on our project to sort of say, we know this is a context that we're operating in. So how do we design this project with that in mind? How do we design this project that the things that are starting to appear on it are built around giving people tools that help them have a capacity to stay? I can't determine on the end whether they will actually stay, but I can say that part of my mandate is to give them the tools to be able to do so, as opposed to just saying, well, we'll put these programming here, hopefully that will work. Yeah. And so that allows, like, as we're doing things, for it to actually be a dialogue of like, well, is the community responding to that? Does that actually seem like that's helping? Let's evaluate the data that's coming out of these events. So I think it's also making sure that we take an imperative when we're doing these projects to, like, when we see that kind of stuff happening, to sort of say, all right, we can see this is happening. What can we put in place that would actually address that? So that's kind of the as it is happening. The post part of it, I think, is there any sort of organization or organized group that would be willing to come in to this space and sort of work with, excuse me, the locals that have been sort of left out of it, either to help give them a voice, like it's almost like the locals in some ways need a voice of power in that scenario to be able to contend against the right, exactly. And so it's like, is there any leader within or set of leaders within the local group that can be that initial thing, or do you need like an actual organized group that would be seen as having some value or power equal, that the folks who've taken it over would actually listen to them and use that as an entry point to then create space for these other community members to start to talk about what they would like to see. It's probably going to be an ongoing process, but I think it's what's not happening is the conversation, right? Like the locals are kind of like, I'm out.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And so it's like, how do you restart the conversation to, because I'm also curious whether those who have quote unquote taken it over understand that that's what they've done.
I'm sure they don't,
Right.
Like that, or they, that there's a part of it is like, this is a fun thing, but there's more of us, so we're.
So how do you set up a dialogue to like help people understand that this is what has happened and that this is a pain that has happened from those who've stepped out of like it no longer represents us, because that actually is a painful thing, to feel like this thing that was yours has been taken over and co-opted. And then also that it's not just about that event, right? Like that event, probably symbolic of a whole lot of other stuff that's happening, right? So it's like that conversation it can still use that event as a little bit of a touch point to start the conversation, but it's actually then maybe to this point of reframing the problem, it's maybe about asking how this is happening within a larger context, and how maybe hopefully setting up a dialogue that has this one point where it is really tangibly acted out is actually a tool to then allow this to magnify in other areas in which this is happening. But it requires somebody being willing to be the broker of the conversation, to bring the people to the table.
Museum as broker. Because one of the things that comes up for me as a frustration is you can see the potential if you're interested in the museum space that we are, by definition, in it for the long haul, which is really what a lot of these problems require, is someone who's actually still going to be there in 2 years, 10 years, 5 years, 100 years. And museums are really good at that, it turns out, being in it for the long haul. But actually getting stuff done and being able to acknowledge pain turns out to be something that's a bit of a challenge for us.
Well, it seems like there's something within the, like, how do you bring the human back into things that, I was telling some folks yesterday about the Academy of Arts and Sciences in San Francisco, and I grew up in the Bay Area, and I remember going to that when I was a little kid. And this very precious building and precious exhibits, and you see cool stuff, but I never really felt any emotional connection to that space whatsoever. And what's been really fascinating about this new museum is that it's kind of all about interactivity, and it's kind of taken this idea of the museum as a social space.
Right.
So they have these like Thursday night things for adults. There are these kid days, and when you go, there's all these other interactive things beyond just the pure exhibits, but there are these moments where you connect with things that are at the heart of whatever the museum's mission is. And so my relationship with it now is completely different, and I actually think of it as a social destination, as opposed to a museum of really interesting old objects.
Right.
And so I think it's like rebranding the museum in people's minds, because I think for a lot of people, museum is a place of preciousness.
Yeah.
And when you think of preciousness, you don't think of something that you can engage.
So, kind of follow on to a couple of points there. Museums no longer want to be the building, the centre of town that's got cool stuff inside. They want to have outreach. So, do you have some suggestions for how museums can measure their social impact? And are they actually doing the right type of outreach, and are they being successful or not?
That's a good question as well. I think some of it also relies on the museum setting up like social impact to what end? Like what are you actually trying to accomplish or change? Because out of that will then give you the set of goals that you're measuring against, rather than it's like this is where a point where specificity would be super helpful. Because like general, no. I'm just sort of saying like then the next layer would be like what is the specific outcome that you're hoping to get, because then you can measure against that. But then I think it's also like that I'm imagining in all of your communities, there are probably organizations who are out there in the community. And so I think there's some element of partnering with those groups to make that outreach in those places. And then also, once you know specifically what the outcome, it's kind of hard to be on a vague, but so like say with Hunter's Point, we've sort of identified that we're interested in stuff around youth, jobs, social cohesion. So with every event, we actually set up some sort of survey mechanism or feedback mechanism that then allows us to ask certain questions about how people are feeling at that event. But we also do things like observing who comes out, right? So when we first did the circus, our thing was like, we want to get lots of people in the community neighborhood, and we want to get a mix of youth in there, and we want to get people who've never been to the site before. Like and so those were things we were able to measure against. So that's something of like for what's happening on your premises. For going out into and doing outreach, I think it's sort of identifying, once you know what your outcomes are and you know what are the main constituencies you want to reach, it's also about identifying, well, where are they at? Like, where are they going? There are already places in the neighborhood where they're likely congregating, right? And so figuring out those places, and then oftentimes, so with the San Francisco project, but other projects I do, I'll go and check out the competition, if you will, like where are these other places where this stuff is happening, and like actually study it and understand why is that working so well? What do they have differently than what we're offering at our particular space or site? And try and extrapolate that out to then things that I can then start to bring, and then measure if that is actually improving what we're seeing.
So one of the interesting things you said right at the beginning of that, I agree with everything you said, but it was find out who in the community wants what. So in essence, I think what you were saying there, what I heard you say was, don't be a museum that push out your message, but go to the community and find out what they want to get and allow them to pull it out of you.
Yes, exactly. And that what they, like to the point of what I mentioned in the talk, that oftentimes when we go and we try and do problem solving, when we ask people questions around the problem. And so the answers we'll get are very limited. But if you're trying to really reposition how your space, your programs fit within their lives, you kind of need to understand their lives. And so it's like actually asking questions that allow you to genuinely understand about like everything else that's going on in their day, or the things that they need to contend with, and then also basing, I mean, it's a little bit different from a museum because you guys usually do operate hopefully in a place of desire. But one of the things I find is a lot of projects are often built around need. And need actually is disconnected from human emotion in a way. It like is a very kind of rational thing. So I often talk about being in a space of both need and desire. Like understanding what people need and responding to that, but also understanding what they desire, because ultimately that's what emotionally binds them to a place. And so if you can get on that, then the need is kind of like the cherry on top in a way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think in many ways it gets to sort of one of the fundamental tensions we have at the moment, where we have been so focused in the past on delivering a product that we have and approaching our work from a place of being experts. And what Liz is talking about is really looking at the work more like being a researcher, doing field work. Like you're going from a place of not knowing to needing to figure out how to find out. And that there's a little conflict there with, well, we are already the experts in whatever our museum is about.
Right, but you're not experts in how the people engage that, right?
Right.
And then and what you can also do is you can almost set up little experiments for when they come into the museum that allows you to actually study how they're interacting with things and responding to things. That then like allows you to then make these tweaks of understanding, well, is that thing actually working? Like, I got them in the door, that's awesome. Do they actually enjoy the experience? Would they be willing to come back? Would they be willing to share it with other people? Like, which are the things I imagine are needed for the success of a museum. And so it's like figuring out ways in which you can either ask those questions or just observe. Like a lot of the stuff I do isn't just about being in conversation with people, but actually literally just watching them as they interact with the things they've created and making notes off of that, and then like it is like being a scientist and tweaking things. So like then I tweak it just a little bit and see how that has changed the way in which they're engaging. And then that's the way I'm able to understand whether or not that thing has actually worked.
Yeah. Yeah, this is reminding me of one of the very first visitor studies reports I read from the Science Museum London in the early 90s, where they had done really substantial participant observation to see what people were doing inside the space. And one of the biggest learnings that came out of it was that people spent 60% of their time just navigating the building. If you've ever been there, it's gigantic. It's an entire city block. And they had gone into it with the framework of like, we want to know why people are and aren't going to different galleries. And then as a result of the observation, they realized that their problem was in fact a much larger, much different problem. That if they're spending more than half their time just getting around, the time that they were thinking of a 2-hour visit was really like a 15-minute visit in terms of what they're doing in the galleries, because there are a lot of stairs, there are no signs, all the other things that you wouldn't even think of in the way we traditionally approach our work. Like, I'm interested in what happens in this space, and the visitor is interested in this completely different, larger space. Yeah. And you only find that out by actually spending the time being out there and watching and asking. All right, Luigi now.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you loads of questions, but I said to one.
This is a common theme.
But a lot of what you said resonated deeply with the way I feel about working with participants in the design process. I don't work for a museum. I'm a human-centered computing researcher that works with a lot of museums and with a lot of visitors and stakeholders. So very often I find myself bringing together these teams of participants, which very close to what you were saying about the co-power view, so that everybody has a voice and it should be valued as much. And of course, there's a utopia where everybody's equal and everybody contributes in neatly proportional shares to the project. And then there's the reality when, of course, decisions are taken by particular stakeholders who's paying, for example, or who's pushing this project, and the direction moves a little bit. And at that point, the really tough thing is to keep that balance. At the same time, though, I find myself sometimes talking to end users, visitors, communities, and getting their wishes and needs and understanding their experiences. And I feel like I can contribute with something they don't know. And this is something that I think museum feels too. So I think the key there is a dialogue, because of course they can tell me all there is to know about their experiences, their wishes, but I can tell them a lot about innovation and what new things they could use, and maybe they never heard about. And the museum and their sometimes centuries of knowledge on heritage holdings or heritage knowledge can provide something else. So I don't know if you have any kind of wise words on how you actually balance that tension. Because it is a tension, and it is a challenge to try and keep that participation equal, but at the same time, allow the different components. Because, it's not like, oh, we need to listen to, the communities, the end users, the visitors, because they know everything we don't.
Yeah.
We know a lot.
Yeah.
They know a lot.
Yeah.
There's somebody else who knows a lot too.
Yeah. Well, I like the framing of the expert citizen, citizen expert, because it's grounded in this idea of mutual expertise. Like that, in architecture and urban design, we had this period of modernism, right? And from the 30s to 60s, and in particular, there was kind of a strain of social modernism where the building that came out at the turn of the 20th century was, this will connect, I promise you. The building that, when we started being able to do skyscrapers, right? And the idea that the Industrial Revolution allowed us to do so many amazing things with the building, and the building became like a machine for living in. And so then it started getting applied to social problems, because it's like, we're looking at the slums. Hey, we've got a solution. We've got these beautiful towers that we can put people in. And then you got public housing towers and urban renewal, which were all grounded in this idea that we're the experts and we're going to come in and fix these social ills. And well, we all know where that went. And the reaction afterwards in the 70s and 80s was this idea of advocacy planning. bring the community to the table, let them input it, and then we'll execute their plans, because we totally overreached before. And then you got really shitty projects. I mean, to be frank. Like, you got stuff that was like in these communities and inputted their stuff, but they were really great projects for the most part. And so it's like, when it's in this balance where you're like trying to put either or, no one wins, and you kind of just wind up with this hyper-compromised thing that doesn't reflect any values. And so the introduction of the expertise was to sort of say that our expertise is of value. Me traveling all around and seeing these places and around the world is of value. So when I go into Hunters Point or New Orleans or wherever, like, I'm bringing in that knowledge from these other places, and that is value at the table. So that's kind of like my first thing around the expertise. But then I think the other thing is, that I was struck by what you were saying, is like how to get people to have an equal voice. And I don't know if it's about, I think equality is sort of a red herring, right? Because equality sort of does not take into account what has come before, what is the context that you are operating in. And so it's why I like to use the word equity a little bit more, like, how do we get at equitable outcomes? And so to get at equitable outcomes, it may not be about that everybody's piece of the pie is equal, right? It's about, like, what are the sizes of pieces of pie that need to go into it to create the best project possible, or the best outcome possible? Because we've sort of set that this equitable outcome is our goal. So, like, how do we then plug into it? Which I think, I like to say that me operating as a designer who's kind of talking to everyone, that my job is partly to steward that and make sure that we can get and see what are the spaces that need to come in. And so I try and operate in that way in the project. And when I'm talking to community members, I also try and, like, be really honest and sort of say that this is not a, like, Christmas wish list of everything, right? Like, I'm really frank with them about the constraints. But I do say, like, I actually do need you to dream big initially, because until I can hear that, I can't dig down to understand what is at the heart of your desire. Like, and until I know what is at the heart of your desire, I can't say what I'm supposed to keep sacred in this process. So, and it's the similar thing with my clients, right? Mm-hmm. Like, they're like thinking that it's this and this, and I'm like, okay, well, let's get down to brass tacks. What is it that was really important to you? Like, this is actually representative of this, with many, many layers on top. And so my process with all stakeholders is really to get at that nugget, so that we can sort of say, that's what we keep as the, like, heart of where we're going to, the outcome that we're trying to achieve. And so maybe constraints around budget come to play, where it seems like it tips out this thing that was expressed by a community, but my job is to make sure the heart of the thing that was expressed by a community is still embedded, like we are doing what we can at the budget we have that is meeting that need.
Oh boy. Let's go more in the back. Nikhil.
I appreciate your approach in sort of meeting people where they're at, like physically, going to people's homes and offices, places where they're comfortable. And I see that as sort of challenging some of the dynamics of power that you bring into those conversations. And I think there are parallels in some of the challenges we face in museums in trying to bring in more people to our doors who don't visit our museums currently. And we often come from that approach, how do we get more people into our doors? So I wonder how you might think about that problem, and maybe other folks in the room, how they might think about sort of turning that around.
Well, it's, by the way, I loved your talk yesterday. It's interesting, and museums are such a place-based entity, right? Like, so much of it is about this.
We've got this very designed space.
Right.
That's ours, and you come on our terms.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it sort of accepts that the only place that the museum can actually happen is in that physical location. Yeah. Which you've started to subvert by the whole presence of digital technology, which is bringing the museum to this other space that you can get. And so I guess my question is, why can't you think of that in physical terms as well? Like, why does the museum have to exist within that physical footprint? I mean, I know that there's, like, funding constraints and all of that stuff, but what if you just, like, released it open and actually said, could we have a museum pop up in other places? Like, it was really interesting, the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco has been closed for renovations for the last couple of years. And so the idea that it disappeared, like, it wasn't going to disappear for years, and so they started doing this museum on the go. I have issues with like which communities they actually made it into. But I think the idea of like a museum that pops up in other places that gave different people who might not go to the main museum or might never have when it was open a chance to actually access it. And so I'm curious of like, how do you extend beyond the physical footprint of the space because that building itself, and a lot of times tends to be this really imposing thing that doesn't actually, part of the reason why people don't go in is they don't feel it's for them. They don't feel there's something in there that it will actually speak to them. So like, how do you start to make it appear on the outside in places that they might actually engage it and begin the dialogue there that could ultimately lead to them coming inside, or might like be perfectly happy with saying that like, our outcome is to connect with this community, however we connect with it, which might occur within our physical location and might occur out there. And there might be ways in which you see people interacting with it on the outside that gives you a whole new way of thinking about how to do stuff on the inside, because you're sort of freed from the constraints that come with your physical locations. So I guess it's, for me, it's like, what if you just like kind of toss that in there and tried an experiment around that of having this mobile museum, or just sort of saying that the limits of your museum are not your physical location. Similar to the same logic that happened with the digital space.
Right. I think the idea of that focus on what is at the heart of what you're trying to do, and is it the building? Probably not.
Like, it's a constraint we take, but it doesn't
Right.
necessarily have to be a constraint. Like, what if you asked yourself if that was
Right.
not a constraint?
Right. Dana.
So I work with museums doing human-centered design and design thinking, and I used to work at SF MoMA, and I wanted to answer Nikhil's question that I've worked with many museums where I send folks out to the park, to the mall, to community meetings, to there's an immigrant center where folks went to, a senior center where I send them out to do ethnographic research outside of the building. That's one of the first things I tell my museum clients is get out of the building. Why do we have to think within the walls of the building? And we've been able to come up with some pretty radical ideas by getting out of the building. I was working with a museum trying to connect their community with nature, and they were coming at it, what does nature mean within the building? So they went out to talk to people outside of the building and learned what nature means to people outside, and then found ways to connect it back to the museum. So I love that idea of getting out of the building, and that's what we did at SF MoMA. We used some design thinking and ethnographic research to get out of the building. So I think that would be my key, is like you don't have to talk to people in your galleries and in your spaces.
Yeah, I'm sitting so low I have trouble seeing the back of the room, so I'm going to stand up so I can make sure. Oh, Seema, hi.
I think one of our challenges.
Stand
the
up,
talk was
Seema.
wonderful. Stand up.
Okay, there we go.
Hello, everyone. One of our challenges is that we were sort of talking on Twitter as you were talking. Visitation shouldn't be our end goal. I mean, I'm really challenged. Like our grant officers, we have a tech space. People are like, but are they going to go into the real galleries? You know, that we have this thing. And one of the things I would challenge all of us, and the talk really made me really reframe. We have a lot of community engagement endeavors right now. We have a physical truck I'm about to get, and we have all kinds of things happening. And I think Detroit does, a number of cities do this. But thinking about connectivity, you know, not using the word visitor. Why do you have to visit my museum? And we're in digital. Well, if they connected and they never go, there's lots of institutions I've never been to, I feel very connected to. And so how do we reframe the word visitor? How do we reframe those concepts and the ideas behind it? So that's a big thing I'd like to hear people talk about.
Yeah, it's like moving beyond, because visitors could get you so locked into an idea of quantity and not quality. Like, so it's not how many people have come, but what is the quality of the experience that they have when they engage with the museum, which then forces you to ask a lot of different questions to evaluate.
Right. Exactly. And impact. Like, how do you? Then impact is different. Yeah. And outcome's a whole thing.
Sorry, microphone. You were mentioning sustainability as a buzzword. I mean, we all heard it, greenwashing and things for that. You were also mentioning design thinking is now becoming kind of like, it's losing its meaning. I mean, it's more and more it's becoming, you keep mentioning human-centered design. Now, more museums, like the Queen's Museum had an experience manager, museum experience manager, the Met now will have an experience manager. Would you think, how can museums start dealing with this, like live with experience with visitors, are they going physical and digital, hybrid design? Would you think of it like something that could help us deal with what you do precisely, kind of like getting people excited about being in the building, coming in, having a nice experience, then going outside? Experience manager, is that working? Or like experience design, is that something?
Yeah, I won't get into the lingo. Olympics or fight or whatever that is. I guess like this is another place where I'd say it's about outcomes. Like you were just saying, the experience manager have a better experience, but is that really actually the outcome you're looking for? Is that the whole point of hiring an experience manager? Like, can we put specificity to like what we want achieved by having people come into your space or interact with the things that we have, right? And then out of that, that would then make me think, okay, then the quality of experience that they need to have is X in order to then connect to this outcome. And then you have an imperative for your experience manager. It's not just about creating a good experience, it's creating an experience that has these features that then work towards this outcome. So it's really just being more specific about what we're trying to accomplish. And I mean, I think that's sort of the challenge with the words is we use it and it ends up being like, okay, it almost becomes perfunctory, right? And that's the thing that we need to not let ourselves get trapped into, to be really specific about what it is that we're trying to achieve. We want to see at the end of the day, and what is it that we feel are the actual milestones that represent it, right? That aren't checkboxes of what we did, but are more representative of what was accomplished.
Yes, for an institution that is interested in creating social value in the community, how important for this institution to be reflective of the community itself in terms of the diversity in the workplace?
I mean, I think it's super important.
Say it louder.
Yeah, I think it's like if you're saying that you're a space that is created for a particular locale or population, like if you don't have a meaningful way for that locale or population to be reflected in the actions, the voices, the decision-making process, and like you're just kind of guessing. It's almost like being blindfolded and trying to hit the piñata. And so I think there are lots of different ways. I think some is about workforce employment. I think some is also about, do you have advisory boards or other mechanisms in which those voices can be able to have some power in the process. And then the other thing is, I think that oftentimes we use the words of like, oh, I want to create a more diverse workplace, I want to do this, this, and this. And then we sort of say, well, we have policies that are friendly towards doing that, and that's kind of BS. Like, it's just like what we were talking about earlier of like, you need to be intentional about these things. And so if that is really what you want, so let's say the workforce, if you're really saying you want to create a more diverse workforce, how in your hiring applications are you actually setting up an opportunity for those folks to be able to get in? Like, not just that, like, well, I had that disclaimer that we're open to people of all races and do not discriminate. Like, that's not really going to do much of anything. That's like a checkbox. So it's like, how are you proactively reaching those populations? And then, like, do you have anything on your application that exists as a proxy, right? So I was talking to one group recently where they were lamenting the lack of people of color applying, and one of the things that they had is that they really wanted to get people who had traveled a lot, because they felt that would mean that they would be ready to be able to travel and engage lots of different populations as part of the work here. And I was like, let's think who gets to travel a lot, shall we? Tends to be of a certain income level. Oftentimes also tends to correlate with a certain like race. So like just there, you put a proxy that's been a barrier. Like it's a proxy for you want somebody who is culturally aware, right? And has cultural competency. What are other questions you can ask that can get around that are not about this? Have you done this, right? So like if these things are our goals, how are we intentionally going at it, and how are we removing the things that actually exist as barriers that subvert what we say is what we're trying to accomplish? I think there's someone in the back who's
Yeah,
been
more people in the
trying
back.
to.
Okay. All right, hands up. Way in the back.
Hey. Hi, I'm going to try to articulate this well, but it's kind of complex, and that's kind of part of the question. When you were talking about analyzing a problem, you talk about what is the context. And I wanted to ask about the idea of a larger problem that straddles multiple contexts and help reaching out to one community, sorry, I used the word,
Yes, right.
one population appears to attack one population, but the goal of this population is to bring everyone together. And I can speak not so vaguely, but for example, the historic house where I work is in an area of town that is the the wealthy area of town, and they always talk about bringing a population, a diverse population there. But the conversations of doing that somehow threaten this idea of that already existing community. And like Nikhil's talk yesterday, like, these are all good people, everyone's intentions are good, but somehow on what they're operating in, just this barrier starts. And so you said to start small, and I was wondering if you've ever experienced or worked in a situation that, well, it sounds like you have, but that straddled those worlds. And where do you start small?
Yeah. You're right. That
Good
was a
luck on that.
complicated question. So, I mean, I think that let's do the Hunters Point one as an example, right? So the community and what most people know is like this historically African American community, right? But you actually do have these other populations that have existed or have come up really in, well, there's always, yeah, anyway, it's much more complicated than that. But you have these diversity of groups there, right? And then you also have this influx of new residents, which actually is majority white. And some of the things with that project have been like the sense of like you need to do stuff for the community, which most people mean the African American community there. And our process has been, they are where we started, right? Like, because many of them were involved in the fight to close the power plant. And the proximity of like particularly those living in public housing was like unavoidable. And we felt as immediate neighbors, we needed to really make sure that their needs were being met. But now where we're going to is like we're actually looking at what are other adjacent groups within that neighborhood. And also understanding that like the community is, the neighborhood is changing, right? And like to say that we're creating this little bubble that's just about this group kind of ignores the realities of how the neighborhood is changing. And the only way whatever is created here is going to be successful is if it feels like it is serving the entire neighborhood. And so one of the things we've been able to do is that like the person living in public housing can't necessarily go into the space of the person living in that new development, but we can. And so taking our role a little bit as a mediator and going and having exactly the same conversations that I'm having with the folks living in public housing, I'm having with the folks living in the new developments. And I'm trying to understand them and their lives and their needs and their pain points. And one of the things is like, yes, there are some differences, but then there are actually some core desires that we can build up in our place as the heart of what's happening. And also, in doing that, create a space where these groups can kind of start to come together and come in dialogue. Like one of the things I've often seen has been part of the issue in those situations is like everybody has a perception of what that other group is, what they think, what they want, why they're bad, you know, why they don't care about us.
Those people.
Yeah, those people. And it's really, it's like that whole specificity thing that it's a category. It's that community that does not care about us, or that community that, you know, really we don't want here. And they never get to connect with one another as people. And it's a lot harder. I mean, there are some people who, you know, will be, what's the word I want to use? It's kinder, prejudicial. Regardless, if you meet another person, they will still say it to your face. But a lot of times, most people, that middle, which is what you want to get, right? that middle just has never had an opportunity to interact with a person in that other group to be able to see them as a human being. And so it's like, what are the things that you can create that can make those opportunities for a human being to connect with another human being, and for a moment not see them as representative as a category, but see them representative as someone who has very similar pain points or interests in life, or maybe has different ones, but I've come away learning something because I would have never thought about that because that's not part of my worldview.
I wanted to just talk a little bit more about the, well, one, reflecting on your question about, like, do audiences or folks that we're trying to create new relationships with, is that important for them to see themselves in the institutions? And you were very nice to say, I think so, and I just want to say, we actually know so. You know, I'm an evaluator and researcher at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and we've done studies which have been complemented, you know, which have complemented other national studies that have said, communities say, if I don't see myself in there, I don't feel welcomed. And I want to sort of push beyond the recruitment. I think the recruitment strategies and really looking at the ways in which we go out is super important. And I think there's this other piece that's equally as important as something we're sort of skirting around, which is internal culture shift. And I think if we are creating these spaces, and you mentioned like museums don't want to talk about pain and history, and I think if we're in denial about the pain, about the truth of how and when and where and why museums were created and the elitism and you know, that's our history, and that exists, and that's part of our internal culture. And if we also can't shift that, like, even if we're able to recruit people of color or whatever marginalized groups you're looking at, not all of them are going to be able to work within that system. And we see it on college campuses, you know, like, you don't create, if you're walking into a culture that you're not actually welcome and a part of, like, we know it, even if it's not said to us. So just a piece around, like, can that work happen in parallel? And have you seen organizations that you've worked with who are sort of embracing this model externally, but at the same time recognizing that in order for this change to be sustainable, there needs to be internal work as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was at Policy Link, which is this urban policy think tank, had a conference last week. They do this equity summit once every 3 years, which is pretty amazing, and maybe put on your radar to attend in 3 years. And I went to a workshop on healing in communities. And someone said there, hurt people, healed people, heal people. And the heart of the conversation that we had at the panel was about a lot of times when we go in and we try to fix communities, right? When we're not fixed ourselves. And like that actually dulls our ability to make any meaningful change. And so for me, and that's kind of why I put at the end of the talk about this idea of recognizing your own individual humanity. Because it's both about the institution, but it's also about the people within the institution. Like, you know, I imagine since you've all decided you're going to stay and sit here and listen to me a little bit longer, that you are kind of compelled by the stuff that I'm talking about, right? And so it's also like, what is your own pain? Like, what is your motivation in doing this work? And have you done your own healing or done the work to start working on your own healing to then be able to go out and, you know, address these neighborhoods and communities and populations that you're working in? And that until you start to do that, even trying to be a change agent within your organization becomes limited, right? As far as like organizations have done, I do know of some, and right now my cold med out and jet lag addled brain is not coming up with some, but I'm happy to exchange contact details. But yeah, there's definitely, I have seen like culture shifts occurring in some organizations that are starting to address these topics. But I also feel like, at least in my work, part of what I do is I look at the organization itself. I don't just look at what's the external thing that's supposed to be created, because I understand that in order for that external thing to move, the organization itself needs to be able to move. At some point I lead the building, literally and figuratively, and they need to carry it on. And if they don't believe it, to their hearts, similar to that, the UN Global Alliance, right? Like we carried that thing, but we didn't like have enough space within our project to do full work on the organization. So they ultimately carried it, but like could have gone so much further if we'd been able to really work with them. So there's a little bit of a train the trainers, if you will, that I think needs to happen. But I would say as you guys take on projects within these organizations, like take the brief to be not only that thing you're supposed to create, but how to create the infrastructure that will enable that thing to have a lasting sustainability.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's come up to me over and over again while you've been talking, the language you're using, things like desire, heart, sacred, pain. How many of you use any of those words in your professional communications inside your institutions on a regular basis? And if you can't do that, then how can you hope to do it with people outside the organization? Heal yourself first. The other thing that I would just throw out there, I saw on the news this morning that the Canadians elected a new prime minister and he introduced his cabinet, and shockingly this cabinet looks like Canada. It has like 15 men, 15 women. They're all they represent the population of Canada, and reporters asking reporter type questions said like, so why'd you do that? And his answer was to look at them kind of like, that's a dumb question. He said, because it's 2015. And that was the end of his answer. Yeah. All right. We have time for maybe 2 more. So
I think one of the things that's challenging from a fine arts museum is financial, right? So you can get people to fund programs that people can see, right? So it's like we would love to fund this teen program and have teens come and it's free and it's diverse and it's great and it looks really good. But it's really hard to get people, and I think this comes from the internal culture, to fund things that, the payoff may be 15 years down the road, like paid internships, right? For college students or for teens that you don't get to see that, right? And you don't get to see the impact of that diversity. Maybe it's 10, 15 years down the road, maybe you can't even track it at all. But I know at my museum, the interns that can afford to come and work for free in the summer are a very, very narrow group of people, right? And so if you could create paid internships and do things like that, it's not showy and it's hard to get money behind that. Because you can't take a picture of it, right? And you can't put it on your Facebook page so easily and fundraise around it. So I'm interested in, have you run into things like that that have really payoffs that aren't just immediately measurable, but are important?
Yeah. I think it's a really great question, and I think that there's a couple different approaches to it. One is like, look at your budget and look for ways to sort of hijack certain things. So like that StoryCorps booth that came out of the budget we were supposed to do for community meetings. The initial paying of stipends came out of stuff we were supposed to do for community meetings. And because we started with something small, we then were able to do something that then got people excited to fund it, have it a line item that funds the hiring of youth and funds doing events and stuff like that. So it's also like looking for what are small things that can give you mini victories that then sort of, not illegally, but what are ways you can interpret lines on budgets that allow you to get some of these things. And then the other thing is that youth who gets a paid internship has a story. They have a story of their life right now. That yes, there's the ultimate story of what this investment does, but there's also a story right now of the change of just the exposure and the things that are coming from that. And that's stuff that can totally be captured in photos and blogs. And so it's like, how can you package these things as just as rich as you would package something that is the flashy exhibition? So a lot of times what I do in the projects is so with the Cook Stove project, we were sending what we called postcards from the field, right? Ways to make the research feel tangible to them even before we got to the final outcome. So it was a way for them to be able to see these things. So I often look for what are the small things that you can make something feel like it is a rich experience, even though it's not the thing that you're ultimately trying to get at.
I just want to comment on this question and your answer, because this is really strikes me when people start talking about money and the problem is money, and diversity is is hard to achieve because we do not have the financial means, and that bring us back to the mission of the organization, the mission of the museum. If you want to really bring diversity to the museum, you will find it hard to fund maybe a couple $1,000s, to bring 2 students to come when you spend millions of dollars on exhibitions. And so what you really are about, what the culture inside the organization is what's more crucial. Also, I would like to add that many minority groups would love to volunteer and do free internships to a museum, but museums need to reach out to these populations. They need to build connections with these organizations. So it's not, in my opinion, it's not about money. It's more about, vision and what do you want to achieve inside the museum.
Yeah, I think that is a perfect place to wrap up because we are a couple minutes over our time. Thank you, Liz, for sticking it out. Cold meds, jet lag and all. Thank you all for coming.